My name is Tamara Cohen, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to our program tonight. For me, reading the book Sexual Citizens was personally healing, if also difficult, really intellectually engaging, and so inspiring. As a longtime feminist activist who sometimes has despaired that not much has changed around the issue of sexual assault on campus in the last 30 years since I was a student, I started to feel like there was some hope. There was some new ways of thinking. And so I'm really excited to be sharing all of that with you tonight and how we can all be part of helping make the changes that we know need to be changed. For Moving Traditions, this work on sexual assault prevention is part of our larger focus on helping teens build healthy relationships, healthy senses of self and self-esteem, and understanding the role of healthy sexuality in all of that. And that's tied to the 3 ways we work with teens and our 3 outcomes, helping teens come to a sense of understanding themselves, of interacting with one another with compassion, equity, and respect, resisting sexism from the place that they are, and also understanding and resisting other forms of oppression that hold people back in their lives and in our communities, and also helping teens connect Jewish wisdom, like the idea that we're all created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, to real questions of meaning in their lives, like the ones that we will be exploring tonight. Without further ado, we're going to get started. And first, I want to share a content warning that Jennifer and Seamus always begin their presentations with. Jennifer and Seamus, both professors at Columbia, may tonight describe sexual assaults as students recounted them. This material can be hard to hear. It was for them. And of course, harder for many students to live. If you need a break as you are listening tonight, please take it. And if you need someone to call during the webinar or after, please feel called to call the RAIN hotline, which is 1-800-656-HOPE, 1-800-656-4673. And please know that you are never alone. And so, Jennifer and Seamus, oh, Hannah was there and she'll be back. Please tell us a little about what Sexual Citizens is about and why thinking about the sex that young people want to have is relevant for thinking about how to prevent sexual assault.
So I'm going to start with a story, but before I do, I just want to thank you. We're so grateful to Moving Traditions for hosting this conversation, and of all the organizations that we've spoken with over the course of our 8-month book tour, I feel like in some ways, like this is the perfect ending to the tour. I feel so grateful to the way that you've touched my own son's life, and I'm a big fan, as is Seamus. So Eddie told us a story when we interviewed him as part of the research that we did at Columbia and Barnard. He was one of over 151 students that we interviewed over 18 months of research. And the story started out, I put on a tie, so I knew I was gonna have sex. And he recounted being invited to a sorority formal, and he wasn't that into the girl. And that's how men talk about women, they call them girls. He wasn't that into the girl, but it was a high prestige sorority. And so he agreed to go. He wasn't drinking, he was a competitive athlete and it was in season. She drank a lot. And at the end of the night, he couldn't quite figure out what to do with her. It was pouring down rain and he really just wanted to go to sleep. And he told us this story as if he were the aggrieved party. Really, like the whole thing was just, as he recounted it, such a hassle. But it ended up, and this is his words, with him, as he described it, having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness. So that's an assault. And in Sexual Citizens, we ask the question, what could have prevented that from happening? So much of the conversation around campus sexual assault focuses on the after, on campus as a hunting ground. And in Sexual Citizens, we shift the conversation to talk about prevention, about what we can do to help young people learn how to have sex in ways that are more caring and more kind and more recognizing that the people that they're having sex with are people. If you think about driving and how much work goes into teaching young people to drive so that they don't hurt other people. Yeah, sure. Like, I'm thinking it's almost 3 years ago that Heather Heyer was murdered. And that was a case of someone deliberately using a car to hurt someone. But most of the harm that happens while driving is a mistake, right? It's people being distracted or not paying attention. And in the chapter in Sexual Citizens, where we talk about assaults, where we share the voices of assaulters, we describe it as acts of entitlement and self-absorption. So the question is, how can we prevent those acts of entitlement and self-absorption? And we frame sexual assault not just as a higher ed problem in the way that people talk about it, but as an everyone problem. And so here tonight, we're really bringing parents in to the solution. And we, in the book, help young people and older people think about how power produces sexual assault. I think that the most obvious kind of power that people think about when they go to try to understand campus sexual assault is gender inequality. But in Sexual Citizens, we unpack how many kinds of power, including social entitlement that comes with wealth or heterosexuality or whiteness, are part of what produces campus sexual assault, which is it's a little bit, the book is a lot, as you noted, but we hold young people's stories with a lot of compassion, and ultimately it is about the most optimistic book about campus sexual assault that you could read, because we chart a path forward. We think that we know that all of us together, we can do better.
Thank you. Seamus, did you want to jump in?
No, I think Jennifer just killed it. So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to transition to a question specifically to help you think about this, you who are parents on here and educators. And so Jill's going to help put up a poll now to ask you to start thinking a little bit right now about yourself and how you currently think about sex, specifically sex in high school students. In a little while, we'll get to hear from two high school, almost still high school students who've been with Moving Traditions Colcoleno program. I think I saw it for a second. As that goes up, I wanted to go to our next question. So one of the things that really struck me also about the book is how really without judgment and with a great deal of compassion, you outline different reasons that young people today engage in sexual behavior. So if you can share, why do you think it's important for parents and educators to shift our understanding of the multiple purposes of sex in the lives of young people?
Yeah, there are three major concepts in the book, and one of them is sexual projects. And sexual projects is kind of the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think like only two academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, it's kind of, it ends up being a pretty important question. It's an important question for understanding sexual assault because many of the young people that we spoke to when they described sexual assaults, like the one that Jennifer just described of Eddie, described what they were doing as having sex. And so trying to make sense of what it is that young people are doing with their sexual lives is really important. And so, as I think it probably won't be shocking to many of the parents on the call, young people are having sex not usually to have babies. In fact, many of them are trying not to have children when having sex, and many of them also are, in queer relationships and where procreation isn't the purpose of sex. But it's also not always for pleasure. And there are lots of things that young people do with sex. And we described sort of 5 of them. One is the accrual of status, where, in Eddie's story, part of what he was doing with the woman he was with was, being part of a high status sorority associated with it. Some of it is accruing new kinds of experiences. Some people are defining themselves through the sex that they're having. We found this for a lot of young people, but particularly for LGBTQ youth. Pleasure certainly is a part of it. It's a big part of it. And also expressing care. A lot of young people are in relationships, and sex is a way in which they express care for one another or intimacy with one another. And the book is an attempt to pull back the curtain on what it feels like to be a student today in residential higher education. It's specifically about the research that we did on Columbia University and Barnard College's campuses, but it's meant to give people a feel for what it's like to be a college student today. And that comes from the sort of motivation of the book, which Jennifer described, where it's not really about just thinking about sexual assault as explaining why there are pathological perpetrators in the world, but what the organization of college life is like and why it makes, kind of sadly, sexual assault so predictable. And that means putting it in dialogue with the sex that young people are having and making sense of the projects that young people are enacting as part of their sexual lives. Jennifer and I think of sex as a social behavior, not a health behavior. So even though we take a public health approach, we think about the social work that sex does in young people's lives. And we argue that to support young people to do what they want, it's important to help them do that without hurting others or getting hurt. And so we're sort of, we're moralistic in some ways and we're not moralistic in others in the book. We're not moralistic about acts or partners. We're not moralistic about the projects that people are trying to enact. And this may be a point of difference for some people, but we sort of think, we need to hold young people with care and be open to the range of things that they're trying to do. But we are moralistic about other things. And so we are moralistic about how they treat one another. And parents, we think, can certainly be moralistic about sexual project. In fact, that's what a parent's job is to provide values formation for young people. And we have some guidance on how we think parents should have these conversations with their children. But we also think that all of us have to have humility and realize that young people make lots of choices all by themselves, no matter what we try and do with them. And it's our job as adults to love them and to give them a values framework, but not dictate or demand the choices that they're making.
Great. So Hannah, this seems like a great place for you to jump in. You've just finished high school and now you've done some thinking about how parents should foster more open communication with their teenagers, which we also got a lot of questions about from parents who submitted questions ahead of time. What do you have to say to parents tonight?
I think there has to be a balance, as Seamus said, not telling someone to dictate a choice. So I think there has to be a balance between being a kind of matron and being a friend to your teen. So I think you have to accept that mistakes are going to happen, definitely dissuade risky behavior, but I know, as for me at least, ultimatums are a definite turnoff to any kind of, logic. So dissuading risky behavior is definitely important, but, make sure your teen knows or child knows that if something happens, you're still going to be there for them and help them work through the mistake instead of punishing before supporting.
Great. Thank you. We'll come back to you soon. I wanted to move to something that, Jennifer, you alluded to in your opening, which is that thinking about sexual assault and sex on campus just from a gender lens does not give us a full understanding of the issues of power involved. We've certainly been, this summer, a lot of us thinking more about inequality and intersectionality and racial justice. Can you talk about what you learned through your research about inequality around race and gender and why we need to hold those lenses, at least those two lenses, also class, as we're thinking about sexual assault on campus? Or Seamus?
So I can start. we spoke, as I mentioned, with 151 students. 16 of them were Black women, and every single Black woman told us a story of experiencing unwanted sexual touching. And every time I say that, it bears repeating, every single one. And so it drove home for us that you cannot think about sexual assault only from a gender lens, because those experiences of having their bodies so persistently disrespected is a manifestation of racism. How could you see it any other way? And so it's about the intersectional disrespect that Black women experience. And that is something that would only be surprising to somebody who is not Black, right? Because we wrote about this in the Washington Post, and Seamus said that some of his friends who are Black found the op-ed super triggering, because they're like, why do you need to remind me of this? But I think that the intersection of race and gender, as like, if you've been to America, you know that our history is founded on a history of rape, right? And so it's a long story. And Seamus can pick up and talk a little bit about Black men's experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe telling a story here will be helpful. All the names that we use when we describe these people and in the book are not people's real names. They're just pseudonyms, and we change aspects to sort of protect people's stories. But one young man we spoke to, we call him Carl in the book, told us a story about meeting a white woman at a party who was really into him and wanted to go back to his room for a kind of more intimate experience. And Carl described, the steps that he went through with her, which included, they left the party and he walked around campus with her for about an hour, because he thought, she's not really sober enough. And so they walked around the neighborhood, and up and down the streets in Morningside Heights. And finally, she sort of said, can we go back to your room? And he agreed. And still, he refused to be intimate with her, because he was like, I still feel like she's not quite sober enough. And again, he waited for about 45 minutes through conversation until he finally consented to have sex. And then at the end, after they were done having sex, as she was preparing to leave, he secretly recorded her saying what a good time she had had. And as he recounted this story to us, he also said that he'd done his homework, that he knew that New York was a one-party consent state, so that he could legally make a recording without her knowledge, and it would be admissible in his defense in a court of law. Now, many of the men that we spoke to expressed concerns about false accusations. And Jennifer and I are very quick to note, every time we say this, that men are very concerned about false accusations, and all the data show that false accusations are very rare. They're not common at all. But Black men expressed this even more acutely, particularly in Carl's case when having an intimate encounter with a white woman, in part because Carl was sort of thinking about what it would mean for him as a Black man to go before the criminal justice system, and the ways that race would be would stack the deck against him in that moment. And so, we can't make sense of people's intimate experiences without taking into account the many forms of inequality. And Jennifer and I here have just spoken about two in relationship to Black students, but those are not the only examples that we need to think about. And we're sort of standing on the shoulder of feminist giants who've talked so much about gender and power. And as Jennifer said, gender is not the only form of power or the only power inequality on campus. There are lots of other forms of inequality. And so what an analysis of sexual assault requires, and an analysis of healthy campus spaces and healthy relationships requires, is that analysis of power and a teaching of young people to see power, where they don't necessarily need to feel powerful in order to be in powerful positions or to use power against others. And that those forms of power include things like race, but they also apply to something like class or the power of heterosexuality. We think about how all kinds of students are in disadvantaged positions relative to things like disability, which we don't speak about a lot in the book, but that educating young people in the dynamics of power is part of a sexual assault prevention strategy.
Thank you. I want to remind people that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button and also a chat button. You can use the chat to just put in any comments you want and the Q&A to put in questions, and please do so. So we're interacting with you even though we can't see you. So your research was about college students. Our work is with high school students and somewhat with middle school students. Do you believe that the work of teaching sexual citizenship, which we haven't talked a lot about yet, is work that needs to begin in high school? And what's the impact of not beginning that work before people get to campus?
So yes, but first let me define sexual citizenship. So sexual citizenship is people's understanding of their right to sexual self-determination and their understanding that other people have that same right. The title of the book, Sexual Citizens, is a little bit of a provocation because we argue that we can't solve the problem of campus sexual assault unless we address, and we meaning the adults in America, unless we address our discomfort with young people's sexuality. That respecting young people's sexual citizenship is literally the foundation of effective sexual assault prevention. So, you know, we had heard so many young women who recounted stories of ending up an evening trying to just like wind things up when they were with a guy that they weren't that into. And so they would say, well, I gave him a blowjob just to get out of there. And like, and that's not assault, but it suggests, I mean, imagine if you routinely met a friend for dinner and the other friend, like you always cooked dinner and the other friend always ate, right? That would not be an equitable social interaction. And yet the normalization of sort of a one-way flow of sexual pleasure suggests that some people feel entitled to other people's bodies. And then we're raising other people, young women, to not necessarily feel entitled to their own bodies. So teaching sexual citizenship young, I mean, actually, I would say we need to start teaching it even younger than high school. It should start, you know, when kids start learning to talk way before high school. You know, the fundamental, I don't know how many times I said this to my kids, don't grab, use your words. That is a sexual assault prevention strategy. It's sort of a basic message of respect for other people's bodies. And there are areas in which we do this really well. Like every kindergarten class that I've ever heard of, or preschool class, has a biter, right? There's that kid who bites. And like somehow we manage to reach adulthood. I have never been bitten at work. Like, I hope nobody on this webinar has ever been bitten at work. So like, we're teaching people to restrain their physical impulses. Like, no matter how tasty someone else's arm looks, I never like tried to take a bite out of it at work. So we're teaching it, but we're not teaching it around sex. So in Sexual Citizens, we drive home the message that there really are things that parents can do, both to promote healthy sexuality and respect for others, but those are things that can also help prevent sexual assault. So to back up a little bit, I think another thing that points to why the work that Moving Traditions is doing with high school kids is so important is that sexual assault is not uncommon among high schoolers. In the survey research that our broader team did at Columbia and Barnard, we found that about 20% of those surveyed had experienced some form of unwanted, non-consensual sexual contact in high school. And so this idea of sexual citizenship, this is the values framework for sex. You know, as not as a parent, but as researchers, Seamus and I are like, kids, live your best life. But just remember that the people that you're having sex with are people. So that understanding that they're not sort of human scratching posts, that is the foundational value of our work. And we argue that we can't solve the problem of campus sexual assault without recognizing that young people, like if all we ever tell them is not under my roof, or if we treat sex as a dirty, rotten, nasty thing that you should only do to someone you love after you're married, that doesn't set them up well to transition to having sex in a way that is pleasurable and joyful, or even like kind. One young woman told us when describing hooking up, she said that getting drunk before hooking up, that it was like taking Novocaine before going to the dentist. So like that feeling of sexual shame that she expressed, that was socially produced. And I think we need to unproduce it. We need to do a better job of acknowledging to young people that like sex can be fun. Sex can be a way of expressing care. And I think this is where the work of Shevet is just like, well, moving traditions in general, but my experience as the mother of two sons, the older one of whom participated in Shevet, is just like, it's so foundational. Not all kids want to have these values conversations with their parents. You know, in the same way that I, for some reason, am like unable to teach my kids to drive. I gave my younger son one driving lesson and he's like, let's never do this again, ever. So I think, you know, in that same way, like not all parents and their children have a connection or a comfort in talking about sex. And so this is where the work that Moving Traditions offers is so vital. I mean, I'm a fan because it provides another set of adults with whom we share a values framework, who can have those conversations in a way that kids really respect and that resonate with them very profoundly.
Thank you for the shout out. And Hannah and Maya, a bunch of questions are coming in to you as closer to high school or high school students. So why don't you jump in and add your opinions here, addressing the various questions that are coming in about what parents can specifically do with high school students, and what is the nature of the sex ed you have been getting and what's working and not working about it.
So I can.
Great.
My high school sex ed experience, I'm sure like most of you, has been filled with videos of people putting condoms on bananas and cucumbers and other fruits and vegetables. I had no sense of how to create a healthy environment where I felt safe saying no. High schoolers are taught how to avoid sex instead of how to have safe and healthy sex. And instead of creating a negative relationship for teenagers with sex, I would say that instead of expecting them to understand consent and pleasure by the time they reach college, that we need to be taught how to have a positive relationship with sex for all identities. Because when I was in high school, all I learned about was heteronormative restrictions placed on sex, and I had no idea how different queer identities were able to have not only safe but healthy and sex that pleasures equally, as Jennifer said before.
I remember when Maya and I first started talking about this at our Kolkolina retreat, which is fellowship program through Moving Traditions. So at first, when Maya brought up this idea for inclusive, like let's dive into sex education, my thought was, oh, we're just gonna, create a PowerPoint for everyone about consent education, and that'll be great. And I thought that I live in Westchester, New York, so I thought my public school education was pretty, holistic and complete, and progressive, but Maya helps me realize that it's actually, as she said, very exclusionary and heteronormative. So heteronormative being like, oh, consent is something girls give to boys. Well, no, consent is something boys give to girls give to boys give to boys, girls give to girls, unicorns give to unicorns, and everything in between. And there was a lot I didn't know about it. So I think there was another question here about, like what we should, like as high school students, want in our sex education, and it would be something that makes everyone feel more comfortable so that there's inclusivity for everyone.
Yeah, it was really empowering to create a program with Hannah for people our age that would help teach them about queer relationships, identity, and consent, all while creating a place where teens can talk about sex openly and laugh and not be afraid to ask what they would see as silly questions.
And then Maya, some of the parents are in the Q&A are asking, about talking to their sons. Are there things that you would want parents of your peers to be hearing from their parents right now? Sons?
I would say that, I mean, I don't have any brothers, so I can't speak to sons explicitly, but Hannah talked about this before. One thing that my parents have raised me to think, and also has been true, is that my parents are there to support me no matter what. If I'm in a situation where I'm not supposed to be there or I don't feel comfortable, I can always call my parents and they will come to get me. And they won't ask me, what were you doing there? Why were you there? And immediately ridicule me. They'll be there to support me and to help me. And I know a lot of my friends don't have that trustworthy relationship with their parents. So they feel the need to sneak around and practice unhealthy relationships and have unsafe sex. Whereas if I need something from my parents, I feel safe asking them because of this relationship that they have told me that we've had since I was a little kid.
Yeah, and I completely agree. But I can speak a little bit to the sons. I have a younger brother. We have a 4-year difference between us. And something that's really effective is, when my parents, now that I'm going to college, he's coming into high school. So these past few middle high school years where, this is a prevalent topic, is not making it exclusionary within our family. So if my parents want to have a chat with me about something or I have a question, including him and explaining it, and also making it so that there's, it's not just, as I said before, consent is not something, boys give girls. My parents and I, we make it clear to my brother, this is a two-way street. You can give consent, you cannot give consent. It is not wholly your responsibility, but you should make sure, because typically sexual assault happens to women more, you need to be on the lookout. You need to be an ally. And I'm very blessed that my family, and I'm an activist, so I was able to help him learn more about that. And I definitely think there are a lot of really great resources, and Moving Traditions actually has, I think there's a Rosh Chodesh version for boys that, there's definitely things that are breached within that, so.
Great. Seamus, did you want to jump in about advice for parents in preventing sexual assaults, whether in school or on campus?
I mean, I also want to thank, Maya and Hannah for that, because I have to say, so much of what they said just really resonates with a lot of what we heard from, the 150 young people that we interviewed and the time that we spent among people at Columbia and Barnard, where, the young people basically described a sex ed experience where they were like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases course? Or, oh, you mean the course that basically taught me about all the problems with sex and all the, why it's really scary and terrifying, and it's going to result in an STI, or it's going to result in unwanted pregnancy. And it's just something that I need to be very, very afraid about. And I think that is, kind of part of the beginning of a lesson for parents, which is that, fear is, not a great way to teach people, especially to teach people positive lessons about what you want them to actually do. And maybe good at telling them what you don't want them to do. But so many of the young people that we spoke to grew up in a kind of community of silence and fear. And it's really hard for young people to express their sexual desires if they've never been able to talk about sex, or if they've always been told the only proper sexual desire is no sexual desire. And so, our big lesson, our big kind of take home is care, don't scare. And it may seem really simple, but I think, it can be really powerful. And, many of the parents are probably parents of slightly older kids on this call, but maybe they also have younger children. And I think starting young is really important. Starting young where we don't shame about bodies, and We teach them to respect other people's personal space and teach them to sort of to also have a right to their own personal space. The amount of times that we sort of like allow other people to invade the personal space of children is in some ways an expression that their bodily autonomy is not something they have a right over. And that can be a really difficult lesson because kids can be a real pain in the neck if they start to think that they have like total autonomy over their own bodies. But it's also kind of important to convey to them that they have the right to their own physical self-determination. And those aren't conversations about sex, but they are conversations that, if they happen early enough, can later be connected with the age-appropriate sexual education that happens slightly later on, where you actually talk about the connection between the importance of respecting bodily autonomy and sex. And so what part of that means is, like, as they get older, the education and the conversations that you have change but build. They sort of change, but they also build upon these earlier lessons. And importantly, they recognize kids' sexual citizenship. So they recognize young people's right to sexual self-determination. Here, Jennifer and I are like big fans of the sleepover. And the sleepover meaning that one of the most powerful ways to convey to a young person that you understand their right to sexual self-determination is, if you're comfortable with it, or if you're willing to try and work in getting comfortable with it, the sleepover. Because young people are likely going to be having sexual experiences, and conveying that you respect that, understand it, and recognize it is really important. It's also important to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health care in the same way that you make sure that kids get to the dentist. So every 6 months, you're supposed to head in for the cleaning, and part of the education of young people in giving them opportunities to have other kinds of conversations with other people, but also to be educated, is through sexual and reproductive health care. The third thing would be make sure that your children feel supported no matter what. And this means either because they are queer or because you don't know it yet, but they're queer. And they may not know it yet, but they're queer as well. And so conveying to young people that you see them and support them, that gender-affirming healthcare and LGBTQ positive institutions are incredibly important. We had one young woman who said to us, "Thank God it happened to me." And she meant, thank God her assault happened to her. And what she meant by that was, the assault was awful. She wasn't glad that it happened, but she knew that compared to so many other of the young people in her life, she could go and talk to her mom about it. And her mom wasn't like happy. She wasn't like, oh, of course this was going to happen. Her mom was crushed, but she knew that her mom would see her rather than just judge her. And seeing her and seeing her experience was so important to her being able to sort of, manage the really difficult experiences that she had had, particularly being assaulted. Finally, so many students talk to us about their moms. So many talk to us about their moms. In fact, almost none of them talk to us about their dads. And those who did talk to us about their dads generally told us about how their dads weren't super open to any of these conversations or doing much of this work. And so, I've mentioned 4 things here: starting young, as they're getting older, respect this sexual citizenship, including thinking about supporting the sleepover, making sure you're queer inclusive. But then the 4th, which maybe should be earlier, is that dads need to step up, because it was really, really notable that across the 151 students that we talked to, almost no one talked about their dad, and those that did generally talked about their dad in relatively negative ways. And so part of the work here has to be fathers getting much more comfortable with having these kinds of conversations with their kids.
And so just a couple of other things to add on to that. Solving this problem means raising children who won't sexually assault other people, right? I think that there's certainly, there's evidence that training people to say no to sex that they don't want to have is effective as a prevention strategy. I mean, we found in our research that actually young women who'd had sex ed that included skills building in saying no to sex they didn't want to have were half as likely to be raped in college. So that is a big effect size, if any of you are math people, but like fundamentally, it shouldn't be on the people who are being attacked to have to effectively fend someone off. We need to do better. And I don't remember if it was Hannah or Maya, but you did lift this up that like most assaults just numerically are committed by men and experienced by women. And so we need to do better with our sons. So what does that mean? I think that it goes back to the question of helping them see their power without putting them on the defensive. You know, and I say this as the mother of two white, apparently heterosexual, reasonably wealthy, gorgeous young men, gotta say that, you know, who I think that they both come into relationships from a position of considerable social advantage. And so, but I think that there are all kinds of social advantage that young people can experience, whether it's masculinity and wealth and heterosexuality and whiteness, or situational advantage, whether that means being older or being in control of space or being hotter or being more popular or being sexually experienced. Any sexual interaction is characterized by a person who is more powerful and a person who is less powerful. And we need to do better at teaching our kids to see and acknowledge that power so that they don't misuse it. Now, you know, going back to the story of Eddie that I told, our point is not that Eddie is a sociopath or not a sociopath, but he did not know how to have sex with a person and see that person's personhood. And he was unaware in that moment of the power that he, and the most charitable interpretation that we could give is that he was unaware in that moment of the power that he exerted by being pretty much stone cold sober when she was that drunk. And so we have to do better at teaching our kids to see that power. And I think that in relation to alcohol, the other part of that is particularly not in a scary way, but just in a conversational way, pointing out that drunk sex carries a risk of assaulting people, because when you're drunk, you're more likely to be thinking with, as the kids say, your little head instead of your big one. You're not thinking necessarily about, cognitively, you're more in your body. So I think, you know, the threading the needle is having these conversations in a way where it's not just pouring out all the terrible things that could happen about sex, but instead grounding it in a recognition that that it is legitimate for young people to want to have sex, and that you're not questioning that. You're just helping them you're just trying to have a conversation with them about how to do it more safely. And then I think the final thing that we think is so important is remembering that this is a social project, which means that really we should be concerned not just with our own kids, but with everyone's kids. And so to get to a safer world, one big policy thing that we could do is fight for comprehensive sexuality education for all kids in America. There's so much heterogeneity across states in terms of who gets sex ed. Even in New York, which is like supposedly the bluest of the blue states, we don't have legislation that supports comprehensive sex ed. So California and Colorado, shout out to you, you're way ahead of us on this one. But then, you know, so basically we have a sort of policy situation where wealthy kids and kids in progressive schools get at least some sex ed, and the other kids don't, which means your kids, when they go to college, if they go to college, will be surrounded by kids who have never had the chance to have a conversation with an adult about sex. So, and we were astonished by the lack of preparation that some of the young people that we spoke with had in relation to it. So I think that there is really, you know, ultimately, there's a lot that we can do as teachers, as parents, as advocates to build a world where there is less sexual assault.
Hannah and Maya, I want to just recognize your bravery for being here and being part of this conversation. And Hannah, I know you're about to go to campus in a way that is different than you imagined a few months ago, certainly. how are you feeling, like sitting here in this conversation and listening to all of this, and getting yourself ready to go to go start college? Are you feeling afraid?
I'm actually not afraid at all. And I'm not really worried. And I believe there was a question about what I wish I had been taught before going to college about sexuality. And I think this past year with Maya, having an intersectionality for sexuality, like learning about, is definitely the thing I wanted to learn about, and I did learn about, and I'm now going to college and can bring that with me. So I also know that because of I have amazing, family, and I have resources that I was able to discover with help, that I have the self-confidence to seek out a healthy relationship, and I have common sense to stay out of a dangerous situation, like at a party, not leaving my friends, knowing what my limits are, getting my own drinks, walking back to a dorm with other people, carrying, maybe pepper spray, and I have yet to take that plan to. So I have a lot of tools and I'm very lucky because I have had access to this information.
How did you get all this information?
Combination of my parents and 8 years of Rosh Chodesh with a really amazing group leader. And I also noticed there was a question about what do we do if, as a parent, our teens don't really want to talk to us. Well, there are other people who you might want to encourage them to talk to. If they're not comfortable talking to you, perhaps there is someone else, maybe not specifically with Temple, but a youth group leader who is a trusted person in their lives, or a trusted counselor. So encouraging of that. If you don't want to talk to me, this is someone, you go and talk to somebody else, like being open to that.
Thank you. We're going to go to some more questions. I do want to say that over the past 6 years since I've been at Moving Traditions, we have added a lot especially to the older years of our programs for girl-identified teens and boy-identified teens and trans and non-binary teens, about healthy relationships, about body positivity and autonomy and agency, and skills practice, about saying yes and saying no and saying I need a break, and all sorts of things in the middle. Trying to, the mindfulness practice that can help people really who may not have as much practice actually even knowing what is it that I want in this moment, especially in a moment of high stress. Be able to talk themselves to a place of more calm, to be able to identify, what do I do in these kind of situations? How has it served me and not served me? And how can I make a decision that I'm going to feel good about now and tomorrow? And we've found that generally parents are really happy to have us partnering with you. Not taking your place as the primary sexuality educators, but really partnering with you and having this other place. And you've heard where peers and another trained adult can be a source of information, of trying things out, of experimenting. There's a lot of questions here coming in. So where do you want to go? Do you guys see all the questions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of them on like, how do parents even start? Like where to start. And I think maybe just raising up a few thoughts on this, because I think, there's this like cultural trope of the talk, right? Like the talk about sex. And Jennifer and I, maybe I shouldn't speak for you, Jennifer, so you can be like, there's no way, I don't agree with you at all, Seamus, but we're not big on the talk. Like, it's not about an event where you have the conversation. It's actually lots of opportunities to have the conversation. And sometimes the conversation's really hard to have about, your child and their particular experience. And so entrees into it can be other kinds of things, like watching a movie together and being like, wow, I kind of didn't love the ways that intimate interaction went, or what that like relationship looked like. Can we talk about that? I mean, parents are the most important sort of source of values formation for young people. And that values clarification, I think, can really happen not so much in saying, I want you to act different, I want you to act different, or this is what I want from you. Can we talk about you? But instead to say, this is how I look at the world. And like, here's an instance where we watched this movie together, or we both read this book, and we don't have to have a conversation about you. We can have a conversation about like what I think and what we as a family and as a community think is a valuable way of interacting, a valuable way of being a person in the world, a valuable way of being in a relationship. And that's like not a talk, it's a conversation, and it's a conversation that happens again and again. And so I think, I understand, I'm not a parent, so I don't fully understand the anxiety of having that conversation with kids, but I think lots of entree points are available. Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
No, I think that like as we've been in quarantine together, I've made my kids watch so many movies, or not made, but invited them to watch so many movies with me. And, they found Grease horrifying and so rapey. And pretty much any movie about, and it is actually like any movie about high school almost inevitably has a theme about acquiring sexual experience. So there is a lot of content there to discuss and critique. I think also it's so agonizingly hard to be a young person now, just in terms of the so many pressures that young people face. And it's a lot for us to pile on and just like tell them to do this and to do that. And so I think the conversation begins really with listening. Like, how are you? What do you want? What are your friends doing? Like trying to make space for them to talk with you about the people that they care about, even about their friendships. There's questions of power and inequality in those friendships that can open the door. And then, of course, if you read our book with your high school, your late high school kid, it's full of stories to discuss. I mean, there's one story where a girl is involved in an ongoing hookup, and it's fine until the boy tells her that he's sad because his grandmother died. And then she ghosts him because she's like, I'm down to fuck, but I'm not down for feelings. And that provided an evening of lively conversation with my sons about, was she a terrible person or not? And the jury is out, but I think that there are many stories in the book that you can use as an opening to talking about, not just about sexual assault, but about what sex should mean between people.
Clearly the book was written and the research was done in a different moment where we couldn't imagine what we're in now. There's a question in the Q&A about kids starting college now, and also high school students in the time of COVID, and what is different, what is the same, are there different ways of approaching what sex and sexuality is going to look like this fall. And also when people are spending a lot of time in their rooms. So,
sorry, a few things here. I think, one of the concepts that we didn't speak as much about in the conversation so far was the idea of sexual geographies, and how space is really important for the ways that it influences our sexual interactions. So space isn't just a backdrop, it actually has a huge impact. And control over space and the use of space is really important for us to look at, not just in this time, but in lots of other times. And I think, one of the big lessons I would push forward here is like the care, don't scare is important, not just in normal times, but also in COVID times. That, like a set of lessons about like fears and can'ts and things that you absolutely should not do, etc. I think those lessons, are what we've learned in public health for a very long time is that like screaming at people to be like, stop smoking, or you're fat, is not a particularly effective way of having people change their sets of behaviors. And that we need to think about guiding their behaviors in other ways and also holding them with care and support. And so providing clarity on the forms of sexual expression that we think are reasonable in this moment, and how that as sexual citizens, one of the things that they have to think about is the impact of their actions, not just for themselves, but also for others. And so, part of my take home is, yes, COVID is very different, but like actually our values, the values that we have about fundamental respect and human dignity, and a perspective where we refuse to say like that how we transform behavior is by screaming at people or telling them everything they can't do. Like those basic principles still apply in this moment. Maybe that was too vague. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have more to add about COVID and advice for people in this moment.
I mean, I think what you should be worried about is the going to bars, not the having sex, right? Like Anthony Fauci is not telling people not to have sex. He's telling people not to go to bars and not to go to choir practice. And so I think, young people, particularly many of them have grown up not being able to explore their sexuality in high school, are eager for sexual experiences in college. I mean, Seamus and I wrote about this recently in Inside Higher Ed, about how the sexual project is fundamental for many young people to the college project. So I wouldn't be so worried about sex. I would be more worried about gathering at parties in densely crowded, poorly ventilated indoor spaces.
Yeah, don't go to the frat basement. Like the frat basement is a nightmare. Sex not as bad.
And that's always true. I'm going to invite our CEO, Deborah Meyer, to offer a few words of closing, and then we'll hang around if there are some questions that you still really want to ask, or that you have asked and we haven't had the opportunity to answer. So, Deborah, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamara. I really want to thank you, Jennifer and Seamus and Hannah and Maya. It's been such an important and powerful and substantive discussion to have listened to, and you gave us much to think about. And I'm so glad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really only had time to begin the discussion this evening, so I hope people will read the book, and you can use the code that Jennifer put in the chat to get yourself a discount. And please also sign up for future Moving Traditions events so we can continue to have these kinds of conversations. It is hard enough to be a teen and to develop a healthy sexuality in our culture without the pandemic. I think one of the things that does make it hard is what kind of sexual projects can you have from behind the screen? And how can you explore and be in relationship when you're sheltering in place? And so I do think there are some things that we've been thinking about at Moving Traditions, and that we are talking about with the teens in our groups. And parents are so important to so much about children's lives, including their sexuality, as Seamus and Jennifer have mentioned. From the very early years, we begin to shape that sense. And in addition to loving families, more than ever today, I think teens need adult mentors. They need supportive peers, as Maya and Hannah have been for each other in their Cocolino group, and as they've experienced in their other teen groups, and through Moving Traditions. And they also need the wisdom and the values that the Jewish community can provide, and Moving Traditions believes we should be providing. And that is why we work across the country with congregations and JCCs and camps and other organizations to provide meaningful experiences, Jewish experiences, to teens of all genders through Rosh Chodesh and Shevet and Selim, these teen groups, and give teens an opportunity to explore their values, to become sexual citizens, and to do so in Jewish community. And I think in this very challenging time, we are all of us experiencing how much we need community and connection And so we hope that you will join with us to create that. So fill out the evaluation form that we're going to be sending you. Tell us how Moving Traditions can continue to help you and the teens in your lives. And let us know if you'd like us to help you bring Moving Traditions to teens in your community, so that together we can embolden Jewish youth to foster self-discovery, to challenge sexism, and to thrive as healthy and respectful and resilient and Jewishly connected citizens. So this is the end of the formal program, but we hope you will stay online with us for some more Q&A. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm sorry that people can't just say their questions, but Seamus and Jennifer, Hannah and Maya, maybe you've had a little bit of a chance to look through some of the questions. I think some of the ones that we haven't answered yet are about working with teens who are survivors of sexual assault. Again, about how to teach young men to respect women's ownership of their bodies, specifically in an environment that is so anti-choice. About programs that go beyond basic consent to talk in the larger way that we've been talking now, other than our program. And then there was a specific question about California, but somebody seems to have answered that. And then about power imbalances within queer relationships.
Maybe we'll start with the power imbalances in queer relationships. I think, as Seamus said earlier, you don't, or maybe he didn't say this, maybe he said this another day, you don't have to have power to use power. So even in relationships where people might, from a social point of view, be from the same social class background and have the same gender identity and be of the same racial background. So like, even if it looks to an outsider as if they are socially equivalent, there's potentially one person who is the pursuer and one person who is the pursuee. Or, you know, I think about an example from the book where this one student who we interviewed was gender nonconforming, and so they really understood their partner was transitioning and felt not beautiful, and so their partner wanted to have a lot more sex than they did, and they didn't want to be physically intimate. But when their partner said, "You don't think I'm beautiful," they felt manipulated into having sex, but also driven by a sense of solidarity. So I think that that lifts up both, you know, when you think about assault, you might think about intoxication or fraternity basements, but a lot of assault happens in intimate relationships through verbal coercion. And it can be in relationships where the people are socially equal in many ways, but the relationship is so important to the other person that the other person can coerce them because of how meaningful that relationship is.
And if I could pick up Alyssa's question, who is a student and sexual assault activist at Middlebury, and sort of says, you know, so much of the sexual assault is about, you know, consent education. Education is about consent education, and you know, there needs to be a lot more to it. And Jennifer used the kind of driving analogy where, you know, consent education is like saying, you know, to learn how to drive, what you need to know is to stop at stop signs and red lights. And if you got that, you got driving. And like, as it turns out, if you got that, it's pretty important, but you don't have driving at that point. There's a lot of other things that you need to know. And one of the sort of main suggestions that Jennifer and I make, we've made both to Columbia and Barnard, but in broader reports and in Sexual Citizens, is connecting a range of things together. So thinking about sexual assault in relationship to mental health and community mental health, in relationship to alcohol, which hasn't been so much a part of our conversation, and a relationship to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And when we make this claim that sexual assault is about the multiple forms of power that exist within a community and how those different forms of power get expressed, either because people have that power or they use it. Implicit to that is an argument that like equity and the broader fight towards equity is essential to sexual assault prevention. And so Jennifer and I think of ourselves as being part of not sort of a sexual assault prevention group, but a broad community committed to equity and human dignity that doesn't just address sexual assault through the lens of gender and power, but through addressing the broad basis of inequality, inequity, and kind of the erasure of human dignity that happens, be that, through racism or classism, the denial of people's sexual identities, and that kind of work, along with other forms of work, sort of has to be done together. And so, I'd say to Alyssa, like, yes, and like, it's so exciting to have you and the work that you're doing as an activist at Middlebury. And I'd love to see you push that work forward, and not just in Middlebury, that, like that equity push has to be a fundamental part of who we are and what we do.
Hannah and Maya, any last words? I'll tell people to check out your materials to bring to their synagogues or schools on the curriculum that you've created. Is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, just one last thing. I typed this in the Q&A, but to add on to Jennifer, being in a queer relationship myself as a teenager, often older people, not my parents, but teachers, which is kind of odd, and other mentors in my life have asked me inappropriately, like, who's the guy and who's the girl? And even that question, or subconsciously asking that and trying to dig in to that business, is so toxic and hurtful, because that there is no guy, there is no girl, and that's not what it's supposed to be. So language is so important, and the way that you phrase things in front of teens really can hurt them and damage their relationships. So also, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is really great. So I definitely learned a lot as well as I was answering. I learned from, thank you both, and this is exciting.
Good luck. Seamus and Jennifer, thank you both so much. It's really been a pleasure to be with you, and even as we're discussing very hard and persistent problems, I hope that everyone who's still here has also felt that sense of possibility of change in the ways that you are helping us approach things differently, and that we continue to do it together in different ways. So
thank you so much for having us, and like for lifting up our work. We're so appreciative of that, and also just for this conversation, and most importantly for the work that you all do. If everyone did that work, we wouldn't have a book to write, I think. And so, just in admiration of everything you all do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have said in many contexts that religious institutions need to do more than just be spaces where sexual assault doesn't happen. And I feel like Moving Traditions is really leading the way in not just within the Jewish community, but more broadly, and being an example of what religiously grounded work around sexual values can be. So I'm very grateful to you personally, and also inspired by the work that you're doing.
thank you so much. Good night, everybody. Thank you.